ons Kruiskyk TV-kykers, is wonderlik om weer terug te wees op die lig na 'n lang breek. Ons verwelkom julle almal en ons is baie bly om terug te wees op die lig. Ons is vanoggend hier in Durban by die Holocaust Museum. Dis 'n mini Holocaust museum. Ons weet die groot museum is in Israel, Yad Vashem, maar dis 'n wonderlike voorreg wat ons vanoggend het om hier te kan wees. En ons gaan vanoggend 'n baie interessante onderhoud voer met die direkteur van die Holocaust Museum, sowel as die projekbestuurder. So hulle gaan ons deur die museum neem en aan u verduidelik wat die Holocaust beteken, wat dit werklik beteken en die implikasies daarvan, en dat dit nooit weer in ons leeftyd ooit sal gebeur nie. Dis my groot voorreg vanoggend om aan u voor te stel Lynn Mattison van die Durban Holocaust Center. Lynn, good morning and thanks so much for welcoming us here this morning, and thank you that you are willing to take us through this Holocaust Museum and explain to the viewers what happened during the Second World War and all the atrocities and things that were done to the Jewish people, and not only to them but to other people also during the reign of Hitler, and to tell the people that never again can there be another Holocaust and all the implications of hatred and discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for my welcome. And I'd like to start off by pointing out to you this memorial candle that is at the entrance to this Holocaust Center and at the entrance to many Holocaust centers. If you have a look at it, you will see 6 lights. The 6 lights represent the 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust. And you will see at the bottom a Hebrew inscription, Yizkor, which means remember, let us remember. And people often ask us, why do you have a Holocaust Center? Why here in Durban, 60 years after the Holocaust happened, have we put up this beautiful center? What is the relevance of the Holocaust to us as Durbanites, as South Africans, and to the world? And it is my privilege to take you around this morning and perhaps to try to explain to you why we have this center, how we use it, and what are the lessons to be learned from this center.
That's really wonderful. Ek wil net vir u vanoggend sê, geliefde Kruiskykers, ek het in die verlede op die vorige programme vir u gesê, dit help nie dat ons sê, ons prys die Here vir Abraham, Isak en Jakob, maar dan het ons nie liefde vir ons medemens, die Jode nie. As ons Abraham, Isak en Jakob lief het, moet ons ook die Jode lief hê, want God het hulle uitverkies. Hulle is God se volk en die Here het 'n ewige plan met hulle. Die Here het hulle gebruik om die Bybel vir ons te gee. Die Here het hulle gebruik om Jesus Christus vir ons te gee. So ons het 'n plig teenoor hulle. Ons het 'n groot verantwoordelikheid en ons moet solidariteit met die Jode wys. Ons moet hulle lief hê want hulle is wonderlike mense en ons moet by hulle staan, en veral in hierdie uur waar die hele wêreld, ons sien daar's 'n groot soos hulle in Engels sê, 'n rise in antisemitism, maar ons moet teen dit kom in die naam van Jesus, want dit is nie van God nie, dis van die duiwel. Ons moet saam met die Jode staan in hierdie uur. Lynn gaan ons nou deur die Holocaust Museum neem en sy gaan verder aan u verduidelik wat gebeur het. En u kan gerus almal inskakel en ook u familie kontak en vir hulle SMS en sê hulle moet nou inskakel en kyk, want dit gaan baie interessant wees.
I'd like to start our tour this morning by attempting to answer the question, why do we have a Holocaust Center here in Durban, South Africa? In order to understand that, we must know what the Holocaust in fact was. The Holocaust is a term applied to a particular genocide, genocide being a mass murder of a group of people because of race or culture or religion, but the Holocaust itself is the term referring to the planned, systematic mass murder of 6 million Jews during the period of the Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. The target of the Holocaust was the Jews. They were not the only people who were targeted, and we will see this as we move through the museum, but they were the central target. And the question then arises, why the Jews? The term we use to indicate hatred of or discrimination against Jews is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism didn't begin with Hitler. It has a long history. In fact, anti-Semitism probably originates even in pagan days, when the Jews were the only people who believed in one God, and the rest of the world, the Greeks, the Romans, etc., believed in many gods. So already the Jews were pointed out as different. And difference is often the basis for discrimination and segregation, as happened in the case of the Jews. The pivotal event, though, that caused the rise of anti-Semitism was almost certainly the crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus, as you all know, was himself a Jew. But when he was crucified, the Jews were in fact blamed. They were not guilty, as the Roman Catholic Church has subsequently declared in the 1960s. In fact, it was the Romans who crucified Jesus, but nevertheless, the Jews were blamed. So anti-Semitism goes back a long, long way, and it persisted throughout the Middle Ages, right up until the 20th century. We're not sure what caused Hitler's anti-Semitism, but nevertheless, it was there. If you look at this poster, you will see pictures of Jews. This is 17th century, an illustration of the Jews with horns. What are they representing? It would appear that the Jews were often seen as being the devil. Why the devil? Because Jesus was the Son of God. Who is God's enemy? God's enemy is the devil. Therefore, anyone guilty of crucifying Jesus must in fact be the devil. And you can see the pictures. This is a cartoon. The Baron Rothschild, a Jewish banker, seen as controlling the world. But again, if you look at the claws, if you look at the features, again, the image of the devil persists. So it was nothing new. Why it started with, why Hitler had this tremendous hatred, we do not know, but we will, through the course of this exhibition, begin to understand what in fact happened and why he persisted in his persecution of the Jews. The other question that we're asked is, what is the relevance of the Holocaust to us in the 21st century in South Africa or to the rest of the world? Essentially, the ill treatment, the persecution, the segregation, the exclusion of the Jews was a form of racism. And as South Africans, we are all too familiar with our own history of racism during the apartheid years from 1948 till almost 1990. It's quite ironical that the Holocaust ceased in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. In 1948, United Nations proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and yet in 1948, the apartheid government came into power in South Africa and introduced their policies of racism, discrimination, exclusion of anyone who was not white. And for this reason, we have included this poster to explain the relevance to South Africa. Now, one must never compare the Holocaust and apartheid South Africa, except in that both of them involved tremendous violation of human rights. But the aims were different. Apartheid South Africa never, the apartheid government never planned a genocide. There was never any attempt to destroy the people of color of South Africa. But there was a very vicious attempt to separate them and exclude them from mainstream society. It could have ended in genocide, but it didn't. And there are many reasons why this was not the case. Primary amongst them was the tremendous antagonistic response within South Africa and in the rest of the world against the apartheid government, which was not the same that happened during the Nazi regime. Over there you have a poster depicting racism and an explanation of what racism is. And racism is, of course, the belief that certain groups of people are better than others because of the way they look, what they believe, where they were born, etc., etc. In the case of South Africa, the races that were persecuted were the races of color. In the case of the Holocaust, it was the Jews who were persecuted because Hitler had this belief that fundamentally what separated the Jews from the rest of the people of Germany, and remember the Jews were white people just as the rest of the Germans were, what separated them was that there was something evil in their blood. And this notion of blood meant that it was impossible for the Jews to ever escape. They could not convert, they could not change. It was not just a matter of their religion, it was a matter of their blood. And if you're born in a certain way, there's nothing you can do to escape that. Years after the Holocaust, and even to this day, many people have said, it's impossible. How could 6 million Jews be murdered? We're exaggerating, it couldn't have happened. And one of the questions is, well, how do we know? How do we have these statistics? The interesting fact is that after the Holocaust, there were not many survivors who could tell the tale. Yes, of course, there were some survivors, and we have many records from the Jews. Many of the survivors, even though they knew the experiences that they'd had for years, were shocked into silence. So only of late have survivors actually been able to speak of their experiences. So where do we have our information? The interesting phenomenon is that most of the records about the killings, the records about the death camps, the records about the ghettos, the concentration camps, things that we're going to see later, most of those records were compiled by the Nazis themselves, who were methodical record keepers. And I'd like you to have a look at these photographs, because these photographs form part of a collection of photographs that were forced upon the Jews of a little town in Belgium who were arrested. There were about 27,000 Jews living in this little town in Belgium in 1939 in Poland. And these Jews were rounded up and instructed to bring photographs and details of who they were, etc., to the Nazi officers who were rounding them up. So this is just a very small number of the photographs that we have. But it's these kinds of records that make it possible for historians to put together the facts and to show that, in fact, the 6 million numbers that we have are not in any way an exaggeration. So those people who still continue to deny the Holocaust are denying what is an absolute historical fact. In order to understand why the Jews became the target of Hitler's hatred, one needs to understand the conditions under which Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power. The 1914-18 war was a disaster for Germany. Not only did they lose the war, but the Treaty of Versailles imposed the most horrendous, stringent conditions on Germany at that time, with the result that the political and economic situation of Germany was in total disarray. They were forced to pay huge reparations. They were in an absolute economic downturn. The political situation was unstable. The government was weak. And conditions were rife for the rise of a powerful, charismatic leader. It took a long time. 1923, in fact, Hitler and his party, which was very small at the time, actually tried to overthrow the government, and he was put into prison. It was at that time that he wrote his infamous book, Mein Kampf. Subsequently, in 1929, the collapse of the Wall Street Stock Exchange in New York caused havoc in the whole world, and particularly for Nazi Germany, who had borrowed extensively from America. So conditions became worse and worse. In addition, there was the threat of communism, which horrified the Germans at that time. And in 1933, Hitler, in fact, the Nazi Party with Hitler as their leader, came to power. Hitler actually being elected as Chancellor as a Democrat in a democratic election. But it was shortly after that that the German parliament burnt down and the democracy was destroyed, and Hitler took over and established a totalitarian regime. He had two major aims. One, to restore Germany to its former glory. And two, to create a master race, a race that he termed the Aryan race, that would reign supreme over the world. In fact, his intention, it would seem, was to conquer not just Europe, but in fact the whole world. He then looked for somebody to blame for the ills of Germany. And the target that he fell upon was the Jews. Now, when we take children through the museum, they often say, well, why the Jews? And I often ask them, well, how many Jews do you think there were in Germany? Well, when Hitler came to power, the total population of Germany was approximately 60 million. Of that, there were 500,000 Jews, more than half of whom were women and children. And many of those Jewish men had in fact fought on the side of Germany during the 1914-1918 war, won medals and been extremely patriotic. And yet Hitler used these 500,000, less than 1% of the total population of Germany, as scapegoats and blamed them for the ills of Germany. How did he get the German people to believe in this horrific and unfair discriminatory policy? If you come and have a look over here, you will see the kinds of means that Hitler employed in order to persuade the German population as a whole that the Jews were evil and should be excluded from German society. In order for the Nazis to get the people of Germany to believe in their policies, the Nazis set up a ministry of Nazi enlightenment and propaganda headed by Goebbels. And what they did was to bombard the German people with propaganda in many different forms in order to convince them that the Jews were the source of evil and that their policies were fair and just. If you look at this poster, you can see the kind of propaganda that was used. This would have been a typical poster. Here we have a representation of a musician playing jazz, which Hitler regarded as immoral music. But that is not a man playing. That is a monkey. He is wearing the Star of David, suggesting that he is Jewish. He is also black. I said in the introduction that, in fact, the Jews were not the only people to be discriminated against. Hitler's idea of a pure Aryan race was a race predominantly of tall, blonde, blue-eyed people. And anyone who didn't fit that was not considered a pure Aryan. Of course, it's quite ironical because Hitler himself was hardly the model of a pure Aryan person, but he claimed he was extremely brilliant and therefore it didn't matter. But this was the kind of propaganda that people would be exposed to. If you have a look at this is a weekly newspaper, Die Stürmer. On the front cover of every weekly newspaper, every edition of it, would be this, Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. If one sees that every week, every year of one's life, it is inevitable that one is going to believe it. Radio was used. Obviously there was no TV at that time. Radio, newspapers. He held enormous rallies, music, speeches. Everything in their means was used in order to convince the people of Germany of the Nazi ideology in its most corrupt form. You can see here flags, people making flags, and perhaps more sinister than anything else was his attempt to convince the youth. This book, and we have the front cover here, was called the poisoned mushroom. You can see here a mushroom, but in fact the face is that of a Jew with the Star of David. What was the meaning of this? Well, Hitler says, if you go out into the field and you don't know much about mushrooms, you won't know which are the good ones and which are the bad ones, which are poisonous and which are not. So his view was, well, the Jews might look like ordinary people, but actually they are poisoned. There is evil in their blood. And this was a set book that children, primary school children, were forced to read. So inevitably, if you start with the youth look up to authorities, to teachers, to parents, and the youth are the ones who will believe what you are being told. And so Hitler's propaganda machine was extremely clever and extremely sinister. If you come back to this board over here, you can see how Hitler managed to persuade people who should never have been persuaded of his policies. Over here you have the judges of the Berlin Criminal Court swearing an oath of allegiance to Hitler. The judges are supposed to represent fairness, honesty, justice, decent treatment of all human beings on the basis of the fact that they are human. And yet even the judges went along with his policies of discrimination and segregation. Here you have a bishop. The church, many of the members of the church supported Hitler. There were many others who resisted, and we'll come to some of them, some very important figures who resisted the policies and stood up for the Jews, but many of them did not. And here, of course, you have the children, the little girls, the Hitler Maiden. And similarly, there were the Hitler Youth, which was a very important organization. All boys between the ages of about 10 and 16 were made to become members of the Hitler Youth and follow the Nazi ideology. What were the laws that were imposed on the Jews during the Nazi regime? From the period of 1933 to 1939, some 400 laws were imposed on the Jews, excluding them from all spheres of society. Teachers were not allowed to teach. Doctors could not work in state hospitals. Nurses could not work in state hospitals. Jewish children were forbidden to go to schools. Special identity cards were issued. Passports identified people as being Jewish. If you have a look at this picture, benches, public places were reserved for either for Jews or not for Jews. This is a bench with a woman hiding her face in shame because the bench says only for Jews. Many of these laws were echoed in the apartheid policies that came into place from 1948, where non-white South Africans were excluded from civil society. And in fact, this was the attempt. The interesting thing is that the Holocaust did not begin with killing. It began with segregation, with exclusion, with discrimination, with removal of basic human rights, but it did not begin with killing. The question then arises, why did it end with killing? And we'll try to answer that. Hitler came to power. He attempted at first to remove from society all those people who opposed his regime. This did not only include Jews, but included other groups of people that he found were not suitable, who were not pure Aryans in the way he saw it, or who had other problems that he disapproved of. And if you have a look at this poster over here, homosexuals were rejected from society. Why? Well, one of the purposes that Hitler believed pure Aryans should serve would be to reproduce. Homosexual men would not reproduce. He did not have the same policies against women, because even a lesbian woman could produce children. People of color. Here you have a girl of a mixed marriage. People who were handicapped, physically or mentally. or disabled or chronically ill were victims of a euthanasia, what they called a euthanasia program. There was the infamous T4 euthanasia program, where anybody who was not a perfect human specimen could be euthanized, which of course is a total misunderstanding of what euthanasia, mercy killing, involves. A group of Christian people who were persecuted were the Jehovah's Witnesses. Why? Because the Jehovah's Witnesses said, we do not salute human beings. The only person we hail in that way is God. And because of their refusal to salute Hitler and his Nazi leaders, they were persecuted. Freemasons, gypsies. There were a number of, well, we call them gypsies. It's not really the correct term, Roma and Sinti, but they were classed as gypsies. Led a different kind of life, nomadic life, didn't have the same cultural beliefs. They were also persecuted. Now, what did Hitler do? And then, of course, there were the political opponents. And what Hitler began to do from 1933 was to set up hundreds of concentration camps in which opponents of his regime were imprisoned. They were not death camps, but they were subject to the most awful conditions. And Hitler needed these concentration camps for slave labor. He already had the idea that he wanted one day to conquer the world. In order to conquer the world, he needed an infrastructure. He needed factories, he needed railways, he needed artillery, he needed armaments. He needed all sorts of things that he needed people to work in factories to produce. And so political opponents were imprisoned in these concentration camps. And this poster depicts some of the harsh conditions, which those of us who are familiar with the history of apartheid South Africa might see similarities, almost working in mines, in quarries, etc., the kind of conditions that Mandela and political prisoners were exposed to in South Africa as well. When the Jews were subjected to these harsh conditions, many of them began to fear that things were getting very bad and that it was time to leave Germany. And in fact, of the 500,000 Jews in Germany at the time of Hitler's rise to power, 250,000 got out. It wasn't easy. They needed a lot of money. They needed to get the appropriate papers. But in the beginning, Hitler was quite happy. He didn't want the Jews, and if they left, well and good. But it became harder and harder. And conditions became worse and worse, accelerating, and perhaps one of the most horrifying events prior to the actual outbreak of war was in 1938, the night of the broken glass, known as Kristallnacht. And on this night, the Nazis were told to destroy Jewish shops, Jewish homes, and particular Jewish synagogues. And hundreds of synagogues, homes, schools, hospitals, etc., were destroyed by the Nazi mobs. And this became a very frightening experience for the Jews, because for the first time they felt now that not only were their civil rights being removed, but now their very lives were threatened. But by this stage, 1938, it was too late. The Jews could not actually get out, for the simple reason that although Hitler would have let them out, there was nowhere for them to go. They faced a problem similar to what South Africa is facing today, what many countries are facing today, with the rise of refugees, people trying to find a new way of life in a better country. And in fact, a conference was held in 1938, even prior to Kristallnacht, in which Roosevelt, the United States president, actually convened this conference because they knew that Germans were trying to get out of Germany. And some 30 nations met at this conference to discuss the Jewish refugee problem. And in fact, the response was, as you can see from this poster, the Statue of Liberty, keep out. Of the 30-something countries there, only 2 countries were prepared to accept Jews. So as much as the Jews wanted to get out of Germany, and as much as Hitler would have allowed them, there was nowhere for them to go. Many had, up to this point, come to South Africa. We do have in South Africa a number of survivors and their descendants who got out during the period of 1933 to 1937 and came to live in South Africa and were able to rebuild their lives. But it was a very, very difficult situation.
העולם שירד אל החושך, פקחת עיניי באורך.
September 1939, Hitler invades Poland and the Second World War begins. Up to this point, although the Jews had been victims of Hitler's segregation and exclusion and racist policies, there had been no direct attempt to assassinate, to murder the Jews of Germany. And as we said before, Hitler was happy for those Jews who could get out to leave. But suddenly now, Hitler takes over countries in which there were not 500,000 Jews, but millions of Jews. And in fact, the biggest population in Europe was in Poland, where there were over 3 million Jews. Now Hitler has a problem. What is he to do with all the Jews who now come under his control? And of course this is exacerbated as he occupies and conquers more and more countries in Europe, Russia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, etc., Czechoslovakia. The first stage, he begins to build ghettos. What is a ghetto? It was usually an enclosed area, bricked up in a major city, where Jews were gathered from surrounding areas or from the city itself and put into sealed, quite small spaces, and there they were forced to live. So although he wasn't actually directly killing the Jews in the ghetto, the conditions became so bad that many, many thousands of Jews perished in the ghettos. In this museum, we will focus just on two of the biggest ghettos, the Kowno ghetto in Poland and the Warsaw ghetto. And here we have a picture of the building of the walls. And the only people who were allowed out of the ghettos were the people who were being used in the factories to work. Otherwise, all the Jews had to remain in the ghettos. They were overcrowded. There wasn't sufficient sanitation. There wasn't sufficient food. Disease spread. Anybody who tried to escape from the ghettos, they were surrounded by Nazi guards, they would be shot. People struggled to get food. Sometimes children were smuggled, a hole would be dug in the wall. Children would be smuggled out, perhaps with a piece of jewelry, a bit of silver, a bit of gold, in order to get even a loaf of bread. But as Hitler conquered more and more countries and more people came under his control, so the ghettos themselves became totally overcrowded. And then the next stage of his horrific campaign began. The largest ghetto established by the Nazis was the Warsaw ghetto. In Warsaw at the time, 30% of the population of Warsaw was Jewish. And they were put into an area that was about 2% of the size of Warsaw itself. And here we have pictures first of the Jews going into the ghettos, as you can see, looking pretty respectable, well dressed and so on. And then over here we have these tragic pictures of starving children, just indications of just how dreadful the conditions were. Now, one of the questions people ask is, why did the Jews just go like lambs to the slaughter? Why did they allow themselves to be pushed there, thousands of them? Why didn't they resist? Well, what is it to resist, and how do you resist the might of the German army, the might of the German Gestapo and SS, who would surround you with guns and threaten you, and if you did try to resist, would shoot, possibly shoot you, shoot your family, punish whole communities if you did. So resistance became extremely difficult. But nevertheless, what is interesting is that when these ghettos were established, the Jews tried to maintain as normal a life as possible. They held clandestine schools. They held clandestine religious ceremonies. They celebrated Jewish holidays and tried to live as normal a life as possible. But of course, now this we're looking at the period of from about 1939 onwards. The Warsaw Ghetto was established in 1940, the early 1940s. By 1942, 1943, these ghettos had become totally overcrowded. People were being shipped from all parts of Poland, subsequently from parts of Russia, parts of other countries that were conquered by the Nazis. And Hitler then realized that the ghettos were not a solution to the Jewish problem, as he called it. And in 1941, the so-called final solution began to be promulgated. In fact, there was resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. There was an uprising in around about 1943, because by that stage, news had got around to this, and there were not many survivors in the ghetto at that stage, but news had got around that people were being shipped out of the ghettos to concentration camps where their fate was very uncertain. And they did attempt to resist by smuggling in weapons, building their own weapons, etc. And for a month, they actually held the Nazi army at bay. And eventually the Nazis set fire to the ghetto, and virtually no one survived the ghetto. What is interesting is one of the things we ask is, how do we know these things happened? Well, one of the leaders in the Warsaw Ghetto was a man by the name of Ringelblum. And he said it's very important that we should collect as many documents, photographs, as much information as possible so that one day people will see what has happened. And what they did was they collected these old sort of milk urns and put photos and documents and files and whatever they could get together. And they dug into the ground of the Warsaw Ghetto and buried them. And after the war, 3 of these were found. So we have enormous evidence as to what actually happened in the ghettos, bearing in mind that there were virtually no survivors from the Warsaw Ghetto. Response to the crowding of the ghettos and to the fact that they had become untenable. His response, as I said, was to embark upon what came to be known as the final solution. The first stage in this final solution, the beginning of the mass murder, began with these mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen. Now, what was done was that groups of soldiers were gathered together and were instructed to gather together the people, the Jewish people in the little villages, in the towns, take them out usually into some sort of a forest, make them dig trenches, and then they would be shot and buried in mass graves in these pits or trenches or whatever they had dug. And here we have some pictures of the kinds of things that happened. And this happened for a long time. This was from the period of 1941. The interesting thing is that the leaders of these Einsatzgruppen were told what they had to do and were asked, are you prepared to do it? And several of them actually said no. What would one think had happened to them? One's immediate response would be to say, well, the Nazis probably killed them as being traitors. But in actual fact, that wasn't the case. Many of these were actually deployed and put into other units, which goes to show that if more people had resisted, then perhaps what happened would not have happened. Approximately 1.5 million Jews were murdered during this period. But Hitler didn't find this a satisfactory solution. In fact, what happened was that many of the Germans who were involved, the Nazis who were involved in the killings, it actually had a terrible effect on them. Many of them took to drink. They were psychologically disturbed. And also, Hitler felt this wasn't sufficient and it wasn't efficient enough because there were approximately 9 million Jews in Europe, and what was Hitler to do with these 9 million Jews? And it was at this stage that it was decided to build the infamous 6 death camps. A meeting was held at Wannsee, and if we move along over here, this board is a picture of the Wannsee conference where the final solution was actually formulated. And it was at this stage that it was decided that these death camps should be constructed with gas chambers, etc., in order to make a more efficient killing machine for the millions of Jews that had come under Hitler's control. The leader of the Wannsee conference was a man by the name of Heydrich, Reinhard Heydrich, infamous man who subsequently was actually assassinated by a group of villagers in Czechoslovakia. 6 death camps were built. In fact, one of them had already been functioning before the Wannsee conference. And these camps were Auschwitz-Birkenau, the biggest, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Of these, 4 of them, excluding just Auschwitz-Birkenau and Majdanek, 4 of them were simply killing camps. People arrived in these camps and were murdered almost immediately. The methods used for murder was they were told they were going to shower, they were told to remove their clothing, they were told even to tie their shoes together so that when they got out of the shower they would find their shoes and they wouldn't lose them. But of course all this was to stop the mass panic. They were then escorted into these huge, what looked like showers. There seemed to be shower heads in the ceilings, but of course what came out of the showers was poisoned gas, either carbon monoxide or Zyklon B. And within 15 or 20 minutes, hundreds and hundreds of Jews lay dead. And then the bodies were subsequently removed and put into crematoria where they were burnt. Auschwitz-Birkenau and Majdanek were a little bit different from the other 4 camps in that they functioned not just as death camps, but they also had a labor camp attachment to them. And it was in these camps that people would be selected. But we'll come on to that in a minute, because first we need to look at how these people were actually transported to these camps. The deportation to the camps was a massive operation, and one cannot but admire, if we can talk about admiring Hitler in any way, but the skill in which these operations were carried out. They had a massive rail infrastructure. The Jews were taken in trucks, not in luxury trains by any means, but in cattle trucks, in cargo wagons, sealed into closed containers, very little water, perhaps a bucket of water, perhaps a bucket for sanitation, virtually no food, journeys that could take 3 days, that could take 10 days, rammed into these trains, sometimes so tightly that there was no place for them to do anything but stand. And hundreds of these people died on the way to the camps. But it was a massive organization. So you've got this incremental concentration camps, development of concentration camps, is originally just for political prisoners, then the concentration camps for the Jews, and then the deportations to the death camps. And here we have pictures of some of the horrific conditions that took place. And of course, each time when people were put onto these trains, they were simply told, no, we're going further east, you'll get work, things will improve. It was again a very clever psychological strategy because people thought, well, things can't get worse, they must get better. And this stopped people from panicking and also stopped people from trying to resist because they thought, well, it's got to get better. When people arrived at the two camps, Majdanek and Auschwitz-Birkenau, they underwent a selection process. Those people who it was felt could be of benefit to the Nazis in terms of work were selected to live. The others were selected in a different column, put into a different column, and virtually went straight to their deaths in the gas chambers and the crematoria. Here we have the people awaiting selection. This was a group of Hungarians who arrived in 1944. They had ironically survived right up until 1944, and just towards the end of the Nazi regime, thousands of Hungarians were arrested and brought to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And we have an amazing set of photographs known as the Auschwitz album, which was recovered after the war. And these photographs were in fact taken by one of the Nazi officials. And a woman found them and gave them over to Yad Vashem, the huge Holocaust museum in Jerusalem. And we have copies of this Auschwitz album, which is the most graphic illustration of what happened to the Jews as they arrived in the camps. What is horrendous is that the selections were done by doctors, by educated people. If you think about the whole development of the Nazi regime, of the concentration camps, of the building of the death camps, these were done not by uneducated, barbaric people, but by highly educated doctors, engineers, accountants, people who should have known better and who didn't. One of the worst of these was this infamous so-called angel of death, Dr. Joseph Mengele, who conducted the most horrendous experiments on Jewish people. Here you have a photograph of Jewish children who have been burnt in an attempt to assess how much pain, how much suffering people could endure. Experiments on eyes, experiments on twins, testing one twin against the other, experiments on women to do with fertility and so on. The most barbaric experiments, and Dr. Mengele has never been found. It is events like these that make us question how educated, cultured people, Germany was one of the most cultured people in the world, could embark on a horrific program as the Nazis did. I said before that one of the differences between conditions in Nazi Germany and what happened in South Africa was that in South Africa, resistance ultimately won, and the apartheid regime collapsed in the face of resistance within and outside of South Africa. This unfortunately did not happen in Nazi Germany. But there was, of course, a great deal of resistance, just very sadly, not enough. And I think it is important to remember the heroic deeds of many of those people who did try to resist, who did protest. We mentioned the fact that many of the members of the church supported the Nazi regime, but many of them did not. And these are two examples, both members of the confessing church in Jerusalem who vehemently opposed the Nazi regime. This was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who helped to smuggle many Jews to Switzerland, and one of the most famous things that he said, and I think it is so important, not to act is to act. Not to speak is to speak. So it was not enough for people to simply say, oh, well, things are terrible, but there's nothing I can do. Because in not speaking out, in not acting, we are identifying ourselves with the very perpetrators of those hideous acts that were carried out by the Nazi regime. And Niemöller too resisted, denounced the Nazi policies, was himself imprisoned, and was in fact freed by the Allied troops in 1945. So there are examples of priests who spoke out, just some of the voices that we heard. As always, the students. This was a White Rose movement. This was a group of students opposed to the Nazi regime, who in fact there have been films made about these, Hans and Sophie Scholl, and they distributed pamphlets condemning the Nazi regime. Sadly, both of them were arrested and were executed. And I mentioned Heydrich, who I said was assassinated. This was a village in Czechoslovakia, and some of the members of this village assassinated him. And what was the result? Virtually the whole village was wiped out by the Nazis. So again, enormous courage was required in order to resist, because your fate, if you were found guilty, was certain death. There were extraordinary people involved in assisting the Jews. Here we have some more examples. Many of you may be familiar with the film Schindler's List. Oskar Schindler was himself originally a Nazi supporter, but he was an industrialist who came to see the error of the Nazi regime, and he himself saved over 1,000 Jews by helping them to work, by giving them work in his factories. And he in fact even managed to bring a group of people back from the train to Auschwitz on the understanding that they were needed to work in his factories. This was a Japanese consul. Japan was an ally of Germany, but this Japanese consul in Kovno, the town where there was one of the largest ghettos, gave visas to Jews in order to allow them to leave. A Swedish guy, Raoul Wallenberg, rescued hundreds of Hungarian Jews, again by giving them passes. This is just a picture of one of our own Durban survivors, Jack Putterman, who survived, went into a ghetto. He lived in Poland. The age of 10 years old, was put into a ghetto, went through various camps and survived, and ultimately made his way to South Africa, and he is still living in Durban today as one of our survivors. This, interestingly, is a German sergeant major who also assisted the Jews. So there was resistance both within and outside. People trying to do something, but obviously not enough to stop what had happened. It was only the ultimate loss by the Germans of the war that brought an end to the Holocaust. I come back to the question, why do we have this Holocaust Museum? It is our belief that we need to remember the events of the past, not just because they happened, but that by remembering them, it is our hope that such horrendous events will not happen again. George Santayana said, "Those who do not remember their history are doomed to repeat it." Much of the work in this Holocaust Center is devoted to educating our children. It is interesting to know that the Holocaust has become a compulsory part of the national school syllabus for grade 9 pupils. And so we have large numbers of school children coming through this museum on a daily basis during the school terms. In fact, we have had over 4,000 children coming to this museum in the couple of years that it has been open. And so we spend a lot of time trying to help our children to understand what has happened, to understand why it has happened, and to help people to know that when injustices like this happen, and injustices as happened in apartheid South Africa and in other racist regimes happen, it is our duty to stand up and speak out against what has happened. For children, it is much easier to understand what happened through the eyes, perhaps, of children with whom they can identify. So this part of the museum is actually devoted to things that are of particular interest to our children. We have here some posters of some of the children, pictures of children who lost their lives during the Holocaust. 1.5 million innocent children under the age of 16 lost their lives during the Holocaust. And we have a children's memorial outside in the garden, and we ask anyone who comes to the museum to take a stone from here and place it on the memorial outside, just in recognition and memory, each one of us, of one of the many children who perished during the Holocaust. We have been given permission to build a room that is a replica of the Anne Frank room in the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam. Anne Frank, as many of you know, was a little girl of 13 who was caught up during the Holocaust. Her parents had come from Germany, and Otto, her father, had seen the writing on the wall and had escaped to Holland quite early on in the 30s, taking his family with him. He set up a business in Holland and thought they would be safe until Holland was also invaded by the Nazis. In July 1942, Anne's sister Margot was instructed to report for forced labor, and the Franks realized that their lives were in danger. With the help of their workers, they went into hiding in a secret annex at the top of the building where Otto Frank held his business. Those helpers were not Jewish, but it was through them that the Franks survived for several years during the Holocaust. We have here a replica of the bookcase which hid the entrance to the secret annex. Anyone coming into the building would not have known that behind this was an entire floor of rooms where the Frank family and several other families who were to join them later sought refuge and were hidden for over 2.5 years during the Holocaust. Let us open this bookcase, and we can go into the room, which is a replica of the Anne Frank room, and it gives us some indication of how she lived and what their lives were like. This room may not look very small, but Anne always shared it with one or other person. Sometimes it was a dentist, sometimes it was one of the other people who came to join their Frank family in their secret annex. It was here that Anne wrote her diary, a diary that was given to her on her 13th birthday. And it is this diary that has been such a remarkable record of the experiences of Anne and her family during the period of the Holocaust. The room is a complete copy of the room, and we have a picture here, that is in the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam. And as I said, we are particularly privileged because almost no museums in the world have a room such as this. And it is a room which evokes such incredible emotion amongst the young students who come here for the first time. As you can see, although there would have been a window, it was covered. For 2.5 years, the family had to tiptoe during the day, could not flush toilets, could not make any sound because anyone downstairs would have been aware of their presence. We do not know who betrayed them, but in 1944, the Nazis got wind of the fact that there were families in hiding, and they invaded and found the family and sent most of them off to concentration camps. The only survivor was Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank. As I said, there was a window through which they could look out. The window faced the back part of the house and therefore was not visible from the street. But as Anne said, it was very hard to live in the same place for 2.5 years, cooped up, with just a glimpse of the sky and the occasional bird that flew by. Anne was a remarkable little girl. Despite the conditions under which they lived, she never gave up hope, and she never showed the bitterness that we would have imagined. Look at this letter that she wrote in 1944, knowing what was happening in the world around her, knowing about the concentration camps, knowing about the death camps. It's amazing how much these generous and unselfish people do, risking their own lives to help and save others. The best example of this is our own helpers. One of the helpers was a woman by the name of Mipchis, and it was in fact Mipchis who, when the Frank family were arrested, found Anne's diary, and when Otto Frank came back to Holland in the hope that some members of his family had survived, he was given the diary by Mipchis. And it is this diary that has been published all over the world in dozens and dozens of languages, and it is said that second to the Bible, it is the most published book in the world. On the 15th of July, 1944, just shortly before they were arrested. It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. Anne's brave words have been an inspiration to many people, and in particular to Nelson Mandela and his colleagues who were on Robben Island. In fact, Mandela says, some of us read Anne Frank's diary on Robben Island and derived much encouragement from it. She has been an inspiration to people all over the world. And understanding her story has made it so much easier for our students to identify with the experience of one little girl as opposed to trying to understand the suffering of millions. At the beginning of our tour, we asked the question, why do we learn about the Holocaust? What is the purpose of remembering history? And this poster, which occurs at the end of our museum, I think answers those questions. Bishop Tutu said, we learn about the Holocaust so that we can become more human, more gentle, more caring, more compassionate, valuing every person as being of infinite worth, so precious that we know such atrocities will never happen again, and the world will be a more humane place. What is important is his emphasis on the importance of valuing every person, regardless of religion, culture, race. Each person is valuable because they are people. Pastor Niemoller said, first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. He stresses the importance of standing up for justice, of rejecting prejudice, discrimination, and all the horrors that could result from it, such as the Holocaust. Speak up when you see injustice, and maybe, in the words of Anne, the world will one day be a better place, and genocides like the Holocaust will not occur again. We're now in our garden of remembrance, and one of the first things that we will do is place our stones, remembering the children, on the children's memorial. We feel it is important to have this garden because we have emerged from the doom and gloom of a history that one would never want repeated, but that we should never forget. But we do not want to leave people with just the sad memories. We want them to believe, as Anne did, that there is light at the end of the tunnel, that the world can be a better place. And for this reason, we have these fountains as a memorial and also as a symbol of the possibility of a future, the possibility of light and growth. Because after all, there are 6 fountains commemorating the 6 million, but also showing the water of life, that there is life. And after all, despite the dreadful destruction that Hitler imposed on the Jewish people, he did not win. The Jews have survived.
Liewe kruiskykers, ek is seker u is net soos ons baie diep geraak deur alles wat u saam met ons vanoggend meegeleef het in hierdie museum. Al wat ek kan sê vanoggend is, dit mag nooit weer gebeur nie. Ons dank die Here vir die voorreg wat ons gehad het vanoggend, sodat u die TV-kykers ook kon deel hê aan dit en dat u die boodskap kan uitdra aan die familie en vriende, dat hulle kan staan by die Jode in hierdie uur. Ons gaan die laaste woord gee aan die direkteur van die Holocaust Museum, Mary Kloek. Prys die Here, dis 'n voorreg. Mary, it's a privilege to be here this morning and we want to thank you for giving us this opportunity to allow our Kruiskyk viewers to be part of this morning. And we give the last word to you this morning. God bless you.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege for me to have this opportunity to close what has been a wonderful morning for us, to have you visiting and for you to take the trouble to share what we offer here at the center with your viewers and with your community. What's so important about what we do is that we are trying every day with our school groups to influence young people and to understand that there are positive choices to be made. That when confronted with the choice, as we all are every day, they have the opportunity to make a positive choice. And we believe that by you coming and many others and sharing what we offer here and exposing young people to what can happen if racism or prejudice of any kind goes unchecked is very valuable. So thank you very much for being here. We look forward to seeing your product and obviously for growing our friendship, and thank you for caring.
אור העולם שירד אל החושך, פקחת עיניי באורך. יופי וחן לליבי הכמה, לחיות לנצח לצדך. הריני לפניך, משתחווה אליך, קורא בקול אתה, אדוני. אתה כל כך יפה לי, אתה כל כך ראוי, אתה כל כך נפלא לחיי. King of all days, oh so highly exalted, glorious in heaven.